Welcome again to our weekly Survive and Thrive webinar series. Today's title is Fight or Flight. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. My name is Ryan Weissmueller. I manage a firm called Fintrepid Solutions, and we partner with primarily founder-led entrepreneurial businesses, supporting them through their evolutionary journey. And it is a very interesting journey these days, as we all know, in light of the market dynamics with COVID, where we go from here, a lot of uncertainty. So what we're going to try to do today, and what we endeavor to do every week, is provide some pragmatic, practical steps. Again, we're inundated with a lot of information, it seems, on a daily basis. It seems like the winds change on a daily basis. But the key, as we always talk about, is action, at least moving, taking some positive direction, and that can certainly be done even in the most uncertain of environments. So what we're going to do today, as normal, we'll talk about just some updates in the market, relief options, and there has been some kind of key updates there we'll talk through, and continue. I will say, go ahead and use the Q&A box. If you do have questions over the course of the webinar, post anything there. I did get some questions, as usual, ahead of time, so I'll talk through as many of those as I can, and then if anyone does have any questions that pop up, go ahead and use the Q&A. We'll have some time for Q&A here at the very end. But the big thing that I hope everyone gets away from it, as well as just a general update on what's going on, are some of those best practices, next steps, key takeaways. So we'll touch on that as well. So where to start? Let's talk about what's going on. The first thing is, and it was a topic we discussed last week, the continued reopening of the economy. As of this time last week, there were 32 states that had announced some form of reopening, and again, it's different state by state. As of this morning, that number is 42. And for those of you in Arizona or ties to Arizona where we're based, Governor Ducey's announcement yesterday pretty seismic in that he's allowing some continued reopening and really moving into phase one of the White House's guidelines in earnest. So things are going to start opening up further. Again, seeing the actual execution of that, it's going to be interesting to see how that occurs, but it is happening. Something else, and I try myself to weed through, I like to get to a lot of raw information and not read necessarily what pundits are talking about, but there were some very good comments from this head of the St. Louis Fed, where he is seeing a very large opportunity for recovery in Q4, and that even though we've had a huge decline, that's going to present the opportunity for a huge increase. So again, all of this is relative. I think we have to look at it as all relative. Something else that was very interesting, just something to watch, and we'll talk about this a little bit with workforce, is unemployment, we all know, has spiked. There's talk that unemployment could hit 18 to 20% before this is all said and done. But how much of that unemployment is temporary versus permanent? It is no question that there are companies that have gone under. It's no question in the post-COVID world, certain roles won't exist. But by the same token, I can tell you just from what we've seen anecdotally, companies are already hiring people back. So it'll be very interesting to see, and I think that'll determine really the shape of the V or U, however you prefer to look at it, based on how much of those job losses are temporary versus permanent. Now, certainly with reopening, there are going to continue to be limits on capacity, throughput. There's going to be impacts of that in terms of service, impacts of that in terms of supply chain, really understanding that very, very carefully. And then as well, what's the impact of remote work? There have been surveys out there. I saw actually Twitter announce that, their employees are allowed to do remote work indefinitely. A lot of companies have been in that same boat, or at least extending that for a period of time. You're likely to see a shift of a portion of the workforce go remote for the foreseeable future, if not permanently. What does that look like? It's going to be very interesting to see how that changes. And then the flip side of that is we know consumer behavior is changing as well. How does that continue? Now, I brought this up last week. It's continuing. The consumer has shifted past the hoarding phase, so they are buying goods, that aren't toilet paper. Amazon actually has it in stock again, which an economist pointed out that was an important sign. They're not hoarding. They are still making purchases, and that consumer is still expected to make a full recovery. This is not 08, 09, where that took a very long period of time. If you look at the charts, that was a very sustained very deep U. So the consumer is still healthy, but preferences are going to change. How does that change how they buy? How does that, again, affect what happens to everyone's individual businesses and just the buying patterns, how they buy, what they buy, when they buy? That is really going to be very critical for individual businesses going forward. The other thing that I always like to do is just give a little bit of an insight on what we're seeing on Main Street. Certainly, we've got our hands, very heavily involved in our clients, as well as, the various folks that we're talking to in our network that touch those same clients. So we try to keep a really good anecdotal pulse on what's happening on Main Street. A few things I will say. We have continued to see more and more opening up going on. So businesses are gearing up, getting ready, thinking about strategies with inventory, thinking about supply chain. That is happening, even though there's some uncertainty on what it's going to look like. There's definitely some forward momentum, and if the train was stopped in the station, I think that train's at least rolling forward, even if slowly. There is some definite fear relative to banking, and I'll touch on that in a minute. Some reasons behind that. I think the other thing that's very important to realize as well is and we've seen it. We've seen customers that were hit literally day one with the impact of COVID, and more importantly, the stay-at-home orders and the economic shutdowns. And then we have customers or have been around companies that have just started to feel impact. So that time horizon, that delay, again, very unique. And I think this goes back to one theme we've been saying all along. There's no one solution to this. I keep hitting on this, but just because, my neighbor's business did something doesn't mean it's good for mine. And that has never been more true than right now, because there are so many variables and factors involved. But I think, really the keys are what's happening to suppliers, what's happening to customers, what's happening to competitors. And a couple other things that are going to be very interesting to see is just what do companies do in the next couple of weeks as these restrictions are lifted, really watching that very carefully. And again, trying to get a Main Street view, not just what seems like everything's polarized depending on what side of the extreme political aisle one is on. What's the real answer on what's happening? And then another piece that's very curious, and this has been touted as a positive sign, in my opinion, jury's still out, the comment that a lot more companies made their rent payments in April than they did in March, and have in May as well. That's important in one regard, but bear in mind for companies that got those PPP funds, they were actually incented to use part of that money on rent. So do we see rent stay current until we're into July, for example, and then all of a sudden some delinquencies? That's going to be very, very interesting to see. So let's talk about, again, what has become, unfortunately or fortunately, one of everyone's favorite topics, which is just what's going on with the small business relief. Few things, not a lot of change, some key changes that I will cover, and then I will address a couple things by way of questions as we end. So a couple things on the PPP. A few actually positive signs. The loans have actually been spread, some studies done, now there's enough volumes, spread fairly evenly across industries, which that's very encouraging. Our economy has a complex cross-section, so the fact that that's not heavily weighted in one area or another is promising for a broader recovery. And the average loan size has actually continued to decline as more and more funds have gone out the door. Again, a good sign, because that, in general, smaller companies are going to have less access to capital elsewhere. So getting those loan amounts down, meaning more smaller companies are getting those funds and helping them at likely a critical time. So those are two very, 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 very positive things that we're seeing. And there's also money still out there. Now, it's going to be curious where that goes. There's been talks about another round of PPP. There's been talks about some other changes to PPP. I'm not counting on any of that, but there continue to be discussions. Now, a couple things, and one area that has been a huge topic over the last week or so, and this is our opinion. So I'm not going to sit here and say that I know the answers, because anyone who tells you that is completely wrong. But I think there is a lot of fear mongering that is happening in the market right now relative to the PPP. A number of people have heard about that. Loans are going to be audited. There's questions around, companies that really didn't need the money are going to be dealt with very harshly. I've seen some fairly strongly worded, mass emails from law firms even that I think were not necessarily helpful. Suggesting that to a lot of ordinary entrepreneurs, they need to really look at things very, very carefully. And I even talked to a business who was down, 15% and sitting there wondering if they should keep the money because they were scared when they were demonstrably impacted by COVID. I mean, unquestionably. Again, what we're seeing, and I've had conversations with a number of banks, I've had conversations with other folks. It's clear that the government, Treasury Department in particular, is concerned about fraud, misuse. There was a case that is being prosecuted right now where somebody falsified a document. Certainly companies that took the money that had plenty of access to capital elsewhere, or there are certainly situations, and I know of a couple where the funds were misused. The expectation is, and this is not just mine, this is shared by a lot of people that I trust, the expectation is that's going to be dealt with very harshly. One key change that did come out, and I think this is important to note, so the Treasury had announced that they're auditing all loans over $2 million. Then there was talk that they were going to audit all loans, and again, to evaluate whether or not businesses truly needed these funds. Now, a key update, and I'm going to read a section of this because this literally just came out, and this is formal guidance off the Treasury's website. They added some guidance to this today. And the key change is that any borrower, together with its affiliates, received PPP loans with an original principal amount of less than $2 million will be deemed to have made the required certification concerning the necessity of the loan request in good faith. What that tells us, and again, there could be changes in interpretation, but what that seems to suggest is the smaller companies, and they go on to say this, is that those smaller companies below $2 million, it preserves the auditing resources because there's no way the Treasury and SBA has the bandwidth to audit everyone. But they also believe that companies below that are less likely to have access to other capital. So what I would be advising clients right now, and my message is, I think if you're a smaller company, if you took a $500,000 loan and you can demonstrate a need, I think maybe take your hand off the panic button just a little bit. Not to say, still to keep a close eye on things, but the companies that should be sending this money back are the ones who didn't need it, the ones who took it, and very clearly had other options, I think, and especially of a larger size, those are going to be dealt with. So it's something very, very important to watch. The other thing is, bear in mind, a lot of companies are 40 to 50% through these funds at this point, depending on where they funded. So being aware of some changes there. And the other question that came up, and this was a topic that got thrown around a lot, deductibility. The IRS issued some guidance that the expenses that were used with PPP funds were not going to be deductible. Now, there was a letter written by a number of, I believe, senators and congressmen that are trying to counter that was not the original intent. Again, our opinion based on what we're hearing is that there is a very good chance that changes and those may end up being deductible, but that's not the case now. So simplest answer, there's more to come. On the forgiveness side, and I think there's lots of folks out there trying to put forth, helpful information. It does appear that there are some very hard and fast truths as it relates to forgiveness. There's a lot that's still fluid. I saw really kind of a blanket forgiveness calculator thrown out that it may work, but it could change. So just be cautious with that, something to keep an eye on. And as more guidance comes out, which we are expecting literally, hopefully by the end of this week, I think we're gonna have a lot more clarity on that. Touch on a couple things just real quick. The Main Street Lending Program, I know we've talked about that before. The jury is still out. Negotiations are still ongoing. There's likely to be some additional changes, which I see this as a good thing. The very early stages of the program, it was larger dollar amounts. There were some other things that were going to be restrictive for smaller borrowers. Our understanding is there's been some other provisions discussed, which some banks are pushing back on and having some negotiations with. Clearly the Treasury does not want to roll this program out if nobody's going to use it. And it does appear, done right, this could be a very attractive program for companies to get some access to capital, to grow, to reinvest, to come out of this and to support, business on the other side. So something still I would say to keep a very, very close eye on. We just don't have the guidance yet that we were hoping for. But I still, from everything I'm seeing, this still has the potential to be a really, really strong program. As far as updates anywhere else, really don't have anything. No updates on the EIDL or any kind of other option side. Certainly keep an eye on grants, keep an eye on what certain states are doing. Tax guidance, I mentioned the deductibility, so really no other changes there. So as we like to get to what's next, what do you do? With all this information. And I think there's a number of key things really to focus on. We've spent a lot of time talking about the consumer, and certainly now as we at least are either entering or at the very early stages of the reopening, really understanding that consumer is going to be extraordinarily important. So how healthy are they? Where is their confidence? Are there proactive actions that one can take? Because they're going to drive ultimately, and whether it's a direct to consumer business or the business that you're selling to is dependent on a consumer, so you're maybe once or twice removed, understanding what that ultimate consumer is going to do, going to want to do, how good they feel, how safe they feel, key considerations. Because at the end of the day, we are still a consumer-driven economy. There's no signs that we are going to stop being a consumer-driven economy. And again, kind of triangulating a lot of the economic information that we look at and trust that has a high degree of accuracy, that consumer is going to bounce back, still in a healthy spot. And especially if a lot of these workflow change or workforce changes are temporary, the spending is likely to continue. It's just a question of where, how, when. The next big question is the workforce. What does remote work look like in individual business environments? And this goes everywhere from, the footprint, how does it affect sales roles and the ability to generate sales? Is there interaction that needs to be done in a new way? What are the kind of the cost or the economic impacts of that? Rehiring versus a new hire, possibly no hire at all. Understanding those impacts, there's training costs to be considered, onboarding costs, other costs that may factor in. It's also going to be very curious, because it factors into things, how, for example, workers' comp benefits, oftentimes high turnover is not seen terribly keenly in those worlds. Do they somehow, and you'd think they have to, absorb to account for all this impact from COVID, but the jury's out. So really understanding what does that workforce picture look like, putting some plans around that, having some thoughts, and it is going to be different operationally, the cost structure of it, how it's implemented, the timing of it. So really, really understanding that's key. Another thing is especially right now, companies are starting to talk about spending again, certainly in light of this reopening, not necessarily spending today, but we're working with a number of companies to reforecast the rest of their year and what it looks like, kind of version 2.0 or 3.0 of their company. So how does that spending look through the lens of ROI, of return on investment, in both near term and long term? It may be that there's an investment that has to be made today that because of the sales cycle or the nature of the business, isn't going to be felt into next year. But the timing dictates making that decision. That's okay, but I would strongly encourage a quantifiable focus on return on investment, whether it's short term or near term. And are there some costs that can be eliminated, costs that can be rethought? Again, thinking about that delivery model, thinking about workforce, thinking about the consumer, what does that cost structure really need to look like? Because not necessarily fair to say that every dollar has to get scrutinized, but pretty close right now in looking at where things go. And then we hit on it. This one's staying on the list for a long time. Cash and the snowball, that deferral that's out there. So, we're certainly encouraging looking at cash at least weekly and cash flow on paper, the money coming in, money going out, what that picture looks like and what it looks like into the future. With 40 to 50% of those PPP funds gone potentially already, what does that look like? There's going to be this tail on the bank and landlord deferrals. So for companies who were able to do that, the PPP money is going to run out, and then all of a sudden some of those deferred costs are going to pop into the picture here as we get into July, August, as I said. So what does that look like? Cash flowing, the rebound, and understanding what it takes to get to September, and hopefully as we start to see some improvement here towards the latter part of Q3 and into Q4. A simple analogy, and you may also see that suppliers, what does it look like if suppliers are owed money and new product is needed? Are they going to demand to be completely current before they ship anything additionally, or will they work with you for a period of time? What does that look like? The simple answer and the analogy that I would offer up right now is the good news is, it seems, is that there's cars on the road again. We're driving. Our car's going down the road. It's not going down the road at full speed, but the car's moving again. but there's going to be tolls along the way, and those tolls have to be paid. And it may encourage you to take a slightly different route to avoid some of the tolls, but you can't avoid them all. So what does that look like? Working through that, and again, really understanding an individualized solution. I've seen some very simplistic cash flow models put out there. Just be careful and make sure that it's something that applies specifically to your business. Certainly as it relates to how expenses flow, how AR and revenue flows. Really just key to understand that and understand the impact of that. So some key takeaways, and then we'll get into a little bit of Q&A. The first thing, and we touched on this, is just revisiting that cost structure. And I would honestly say at this point, a fairly deep revisiting. Talking to the management team, talking to key constituents externally. It's an opportunity, again, with suppliers, with key partners. What does that cost structure look like? Certainly the physical plant, the office environment, for those in a manufacturing space, manufacturing lines are going to operate differently. What does that look like? There's training considerations, in terms of bringing a workforce back, or at a minimum, bringing a workforce back under a different operating paradigm with some of the cleaning protocols and everything else that we're going to see. What do things look like from a marketing perspective? And I think another key piece of this is just understanding, just because things are open. I heard a great conversation earlier today from someone who, in Arizona, when the restaurants reopened again, they went out to dinner the first night to one of their favorite restaurants. And, the waiters were wearing gloves and masks. And his comment was, it just felt very, very weird. And he wasn't sure he was going to go back, so quickly. That's going to be out there, that consumer behavior. So even though things are reopening, making sure that cost structure can be nimble, can be flexible, so that it can be managed through this, and certainly just scrutinizing that and understanding. And maybe it's even a case of some triggers where, okay, we're gonna go with this kind of skeleton version for the next 30 days, see where some things happen, and then if things fall into line, maybe at that point we add these expenses back in. Maybe we reinitiate PR. Maybe we're staggering how we're bringing people back into a manufacturing environment, et cetera. Last week, we talked about completing the picture of the consumer, the new consumer, because the consumer is clearly different. I think this time around, and hopefully that's already behind us, this time around, it's just as important to focus on the how to use that picture, how to apply that picture. What do you do with that picture? And then equally as important, so what does that consumer really look like? And then equally as important, how do you monitor? How do you continue to map that? How do you follow the changes of what happens with that consumer over time? So how do you best serve them, today and going forward? And there's multiple considerations, and I think both these matter. There's how do you serve them most cost effectively, but perhaps even more so important right now to weigh into this is how do you serve them cash effectively? So for companies most companies right now aren't sitting on a ton of cash, how do you maximize those resources? You still have to ensure that there's ultimately a profit conversation, but there may be some answers to doing something, creatively for a period of time. But if you don't have that clear picture that you're using, monitoring, and changing the business around of that consumer, it's going to be very, very hard to respond in the nimble way you probably need to. And then the last big takeaway I'll leave you with is talking to your bank. This is something that we've brought up numerous occasions. We have found banks to be incredibly supportive, consultative, very much acting as partners through all this. Now is a great time to talk to them for a couple reasons. It's a critical point, but also for most businesses or for most banks, I should say, they are in a lull right now where a lot of the PPP funding has occurred. And we are, let's say, 30 days away from some of the forgiveness conversations occurring. So where they have been heads down in so many things, I have had more bankers answer my calls this week when I called than I probably have in the last 3 weeks combined. They're a little bit more available. So having the conversation with them, talk to them about what's going on in your business, update them on 2020 plans. A lot of banks have brought this up before, reaching out proactively to understand what's going on with the effects of COVID and how that impacts things. You may have renewals. Just understanding what their outlook is, what they're expecting their customers to do. It's a really, really good time to have a conversation with them, as well as, and I'll tack into this and touch on it a little bit more in the Q&A. Understanding they're going to know what's going to happen on the forgiveness piece. So another great reason to pick up the phone, talk to that banker. And I would also say, if your banker's not talking to you, if they're not giving you any answers, if they're not being supportive right now, look for another bank. It's probably a good time to do that, because you are going to need that partner going forward. So with that, as always, we brush through a lot of this pretty quick. The goal is just to get some key information out. Want to make it as impactful as we can, but also respect everybody's time and keep these to be really quick hits. So I'll open it up now to Q&A. I did get a few questions, as I mentioned ahead of time, so we'll circle through those. And certainly if anybody has anything that pops up, go ahead and use that Q&A window. A lot of the questions, no surprise, centered around PPP, but one was focused on cash flow as well. So I'll touch on that one briefly before we wrap. One of the questions around PPP, and just to clarify this, because I think there has been some confusion, even based on the Treasury, we fully expect the SBA, Washington is going to provide further governance around, guidance around forgiveness, and we're expecting good guidance. But at the end of the day, and especially now with the change I mentioned earlier, where the SBA is not going to be auditing anything under $2 million, the banks are going to be relied upon to evaluate forgiveness. So, where the question came in of kind of who's kind of the final straw on that, it's going to be the bank. And so, Treasury's even confirmed that. Ultimately, the bank that did the deal is going to be the bank that works through the forgiveness. As I remind everybody, the banks don't want these sitting on their books forever, having a loan at 1%. So, if they made a good loan, if the funds were used appropriately, again, in our opinion, we're going to see, we don't expect a huge issue with forgiveness in those circumstances. Have good documentation, have a good business case, be able to support why the funds were necessary, how they were used, show that impact. And again, as we talked about, this was another question that came up. Just because a business maybe didn't take a profit impact doesn't mean they didn't take an impact elsewhere. So, we know of plenty of businesses, for example, that were very much damaged from a cash flow perspective. So, maybe their customers all of a sudden, accounts receivable got stretched very far, and they then chose to stretch out a lot of expenses themselves, maybe halted marketing spending, cut executive salaries, certainly, know business owners that have put some money back into the business. Just having that clear-cut case, even and kind of now is not a bad time while it's still fresh to collect some of those facts, but have the conversation with your bank. They may have their own forgiveness calculators that they put out. So have the conversation with the bank, talk through it with them. And that's going to be certainly very, very key. The other question that came out relative to forgiveness was again, has there been a hard date on when we're going to get kind of the final answer on this? Simple answer is no. And that has been extraordinarily frustrating, not just for us, but for a lot of people. Tomorrow, as a reminder, is the hard date to basically give the money back with no penalty. And if there is some real concern, certainly talk to your attorney. I'd talk to your banker. But I know a lot of businesses that were concerned, I would tell you, unnecessarily, because they had very legitimate reasons for getting the capital, no access to capital elsewhere. I don't think it's a time for fear. And again, we have to bear in mind, in an election year, I don't think Washington's going to try to irritate, a vast majority of small business constituents. So, I think we've already seen some clarification of the positive there. Would expect that to continue. The last question I'll touch on, and I don't see anything new coming across in the Q&A box here, was specifically relative to cash flow and cash flow forecasting, and just some tips and thoughts around that. Simplest answer, there's a lot of different ways of skinning the cat. We're fans of a 13-week rolling cash flow. And I think equally important, and just some best practices around it, is it's, most importantly, like anything, take a stab at it, put something on paper, but then memorialize that, because it's equally as valuable once you put cash flow down to actually go back and review how did we actually do against what we had forecast. That's going to allow you to get smarter as a business. And it's still okay to make, some high level assumptions on things. There's nothing wrong with that. There aren't certainties in forecasting. I've never nailed a cash flow forecast perfectly. And quite frankly, I think I'm pretty good at it. That's not the goal, is to nail it. The goal is it's a tool to allow you directionally to make some decisions. So getting things down on paper, making some assumptions, and the only other key to it, I would say, just by way of a tip, is be conservative. Even if you've got a customer that has always paid you net 45, and next week would be within the 45 days, does it make sense to push that out a little bit? So maybe pushing back revenue a little bit, pushing up expenses, that might create a little bit of a murkier picture, or a uglier picture, I should say, not murkier, than what's going to be reality. But here's the thing with cash flow: if you end up with more cash, that's a win. What you don't want to do is end up with less than you forecast. That's where the challenge is, because if you're going to use it as a tool, it's super essential that you can at least manage to the downside. So we are right at 4:01 here, 30 minutes on the dot. Certainly, my information is up on the screen. I would encourage everyone, and the audience has been great about it thus far. If you do have questions or further follow-ups throughout the course of the week, that is where you can find me. Certainly we can continue to try to put as much information as we can out there on, LinkedIn, our website, and are staying very close to a lot of this. It is changing very, very rapidly. Look forward to bringing some new updates to you next week. I do expect we are going to have some guidance certainly on the PPP by then. In the interim, stay strong, stay safe. Looking forward to getting to the other side with all of you. Take care, and thanks for joining us.